Welcome to the third lecture in our online course on mindfully facing climate change. And the relevant part of the Four Noble Truths for this lecture will be the third truth, which is liberation. And in some way, I need to bring in the topic of full liberation, awakening to my overall presentation, but I will do that in more detail in the next lecture. In this lecture, I rather take up a related concept of liberation. We have different definitions of liberation in early Buddhist discourse. There is final liberation with the four stages of awakening, and there is temporary liberation. Temporary liberation is, for example, the divine abodes, the Brahma Viharas. It is a state of mind that is temporarily free, but that does not bring about on its own the final liberation that is the ultimate goal of early Buddhist teaching. However, the Brahmaviharas can offer substantially support for that, and they are also of relevance to my overall topic here, how to face climate change. And so this third lecture will be particularly on these Brahmaviharas, the divine abodes, bringing in some context for the meditation practice that will be on this topic. And I want to start with a description of a group of monastics who live together in a spirit of harmony and metta, as it kind of offers a nice contrast to the description we had in the last lecture of the increasing ethical deterioration leading up to all-time low point in moral conduct where even family members start killing each other. So let us look at the relevant passage. I mean, already this short description sets such a contrast to what we had in the discourse on the world ruler. They're living in harmony, looking at each other with kind eyes. And such living in communal harmony is not something that just kind of happens on its own, but it's something that is actually the outcome of cultivation of the mind. And the discourse gives us several aspects or practices or dimensions of how such communal living in harmony can be brought about. So this is a reflection that each of them has. It is it's kind of a gloss or more detailed explanation of their earlier description that they live with mutual appreciation. Appreciation for the other, thinking that it's really a benefit, a great gain that I'm living with such a companion in the holy life. Holy life is a standard expression in the early discourses for the monastic life, and this is a group of monastics here who are living together in such harmony. And in addition to appreciation, another quality that is kind of the root of this whole description is metta. So this passage shows the pervasiveness of metta. This is where metta in the early discourses stands out among the four Brahmaviharas, the four divine abodes. That is kind of the foundation quality that extends through our daily life, bodily, verbal, mental acts. The other Brahmaviharas do not have this pervasive kind of scope of application. And it's also noticeable that it says of cultivating metta openly and privately. The idea is that there are some deeds of metta that I do and others notice, but there are others which I might do, even others don't notice it. The commentary says, for example, if I see that one of my cohabitators has left something in disorder, I just put it right. And the other might not even notice that he or she has left it in disorder, so won't notice that I have put it in order. But it's just out of this basic spirit of metta, which I would translate as maybe well wishing or kindness. Benevolence is my favorite translation. The standard translation of loving kindness, by bringing in that word love, can have some misleading connotations. So it's this basic attitude of kindness, of quite literally being a friend. Metta comes from mitra, friend, to others, whether they notice it or not. It is an attitude that does not rely on reciprocation. It does not need confirmation from the outside. And by acting in this way, it becomes a Brahmavihara, a divine abode, a little bit in the sense that in the spirit, we are almost living in heaven, even though we are still on earth. But that is not all. There comes more of relevance to cultivating this practice. Yeah, this is, I think, particularly powerful. It points to the diminishing of self-centeredness. Although metta and the other divine abodes are not capable on their own to lead us to the full realization of not self and emptiness, they can make a rather substantial contribution to diminishing self-centeredness. Why do I always have to have things exactly my way? Is it not possible to step back and just go along with the way others want things to be? And this kind of lack of felt need that my ideas, my preferences, my plans make the front page, it's just so conducive to harmony. And as a result of that, these monastics here in this story, they can actually say that they are different in body but one in mind. I find that very beautiful expression. Now, all this description of communal harmony is not without relevance to the environment. So we get here a description of how they keep the place where they were living together running and in order. But the important part is the last one, the dropping of any leftovers into water where there's no life. And this is a concern with pollution, which is quite recurrent in the early discourses. And we find this relevant to monastics and to laity. There are other episodes where the Buddha is invited to a meal and there's some leftover food. He again tells the lay donors, put it somewhere where it will not cause pollution into water where there's no life. So there's a very clear concern with harmony develop within, affecting human relationships, and then moving out into the environment. The concern of harmony, of not causing any pollution. Now, from this topic of harmonious living together, I would like to take a look at the four divine abodes, at each of them in their distinct quality or characteristic. And this can most easily be done by looking at the opposites. There's a passage that describes what each of the divine abodes is exactly opposite to. So, in this sentence, the liberation of the mind is just a description of the meditative cultivation of this divine abode, free from confines. That is the liberation I mentioned earlier, temporary liberation. And so we get metta as the release from ill will. It's the exact opposite. This is not in terms of final release, complete eradication from ill will, which would require one of the stages of awakening, exactly the third one of the four. But it is such that somebody who cultivates metta will be gradually less and less prone to ill will. And as we move on to the next, then we get compassion as the release from harming or cruelty. Sympathetic joy as the release from discontent. And equanimity as the release from sensual lust. If we look at these four altogether, ill will, harming, discontent, and sensual lust, then for environmental concerns, the topic of harming is naturally stands out. So what I'm saying here is that for my main topic, compassion is the central one out of the divine abodes, the concern with the absence of harm, of not causing any harm. And in early Buddhist thought, such compassion is closely related to metta, but it's different. It is not that compassion is metta directed towards those who are suffering. Compassion, metta, and all of these divine abodes are directed to all beings. They do not differ in their object, therefore their quality does not depend on the object. Compassion is this basic wishing for the absence of harm, and this can be illustrated with another passage. So what we have here is the description of someone who is sick, has become sick along some travel road, and without any kind of assistance that he would need or she would need. So what we have here is somebody else sees this traveler, sees that this traveler, he or she is sick and in need of help, and arouses the wish that this traveler might find assistance, maybe relief from the suffering. And I think there's two important points that I would like to tease out from this passage. One, first of all, is that the onlooker has no relationship to the harm caused. It's actually not the harm caused by anybody intentionally. It's just that this person who was traveling just happened to get sick in a place where no assistance is available. But nevertheless, compassion is there. It doesn't mean only that I refrain from harm, but that I wish the absence of harm, whether it is caused by me, by others, or by circumstances. The other point I would like to make, and this is fairly important to have a proper appreciation of compassion in early Buddhism, is that compassion is not to dwell in the pain of the other. This changes with some later Buddhist traditions, and there is a tendency to intentionally take onto oneself the pain of others, which in certain historical and dogmatic practical context has its own meaning. I'm not disputing that, but that is not the understanding of compassion in early Buddhism. The vision of the sick person leads to the wish that this person may be relieved. So the first, our perception of the suffering or pain leads on to a vision of something that is positive. The vision of this person getting all the kind of assistance, medicine, care needed. And this is a positive object of the mind. And by taking a positive object of the mind, compassion can become a joyful experience. So compassion is not dwelling in grief. It's not just taking in the pain of others, but it shifts from the first apperception of pain and suffering to something positive. And in this discourse, we are not being told about any action taken by the person who sees the sick traveler. And this is simply due to the context. Actually, this passage is part of one of the different ways on how one can counter resentment when one sees somebody behaving in very unwholesome and bad ways. In the context of that illustration, it is natural that the person who sees the sick one doesn't take the actual taking of action is not being described. But compassion, of course, spurs on into action. And if the story were to continue, then we would see this other person doing whatever he or she can so that the sick one gets assistance. The actual disposition of compassion or the other Brahmaviharas is based on their meditative cultivation. And this again differs quite substantially from later tradition. In later tradition, there is this idea that the meditative cultivation involves a set of phrases, and these we direct first to ourselves and then to a friend, a neutral person, and an enemy. This is all very valuable, no doubt, but it is not found in the suttas. And in the suttas, instead, what we find is an arousing of the attitude that just radiates in all directions. And there's evidence in the suttas that this is not just a very advanced stage of practice, but it's actually the way that practice was done. Let us look at a passage. So, what this describes is a pervasion of all directions. with compassion or with the other divine abodes. First direction, second, third, fourth, above, below, in everywhere, everywhere, every way. And then qualifies the mind as being abundant, exalted, and immeasurable. Immeasurable or boundless is another term for the Brahmaviharas, appamana. No limit, no boundary. And this boundless radiation, which, as far as I can tell, is really the standard approach to meditative cultivation, has an illustration and a simile involving a conch blower. Here we have an image. This is the kind of sound that when somebody is better than me at blowing this conch comes out. It's very beautiful and very pervasive. The blowing of such a conch in ancient India is used for religious ceremonies, but it's also used in warfare because the conch is so loud that the sound penetrates over the noise of the battle. And I think the conch was used on purpose to convey this all pervasiveness and the beauty of radiating one of the Brahma Viharas. And with this all pervasiveness of the Brahma Viharas, there is also really no place left for the opposite states, the defilements, harming or ill will, anger, in the case of metta and compassion. They simply have no ground to stand on in that boundless liberation of the mind. And this is of some relevance again for the overall topic of how to face environmental destruction, because there can sometimes be a sense, a felt need for anger. And I briefly mentioned already in the last lecture that to the best of my knowledge in early Buddhist thought, there's not really room for righteous anger. And that anger is part of the causes of the problem. It cannot be part of the solution. And to strengthen that point, I would like us to look at another passage. This is such a strong image. Just imagine bandits cutting you to pieces with a two-handled saw. And the situation described here, I think, needs to be understood as implying that one has no chance to escape from this horrible treatment by these bandits. The point of this is not to say that we should just let others abuse us and do whatever they like. If we see the bandits coming with their saw and we can escape, we of course escape. Instead, I think the simile should be interpreted to mean that there's simply no chance to avoid it. So in this situation, where these people are cutting us into pieces, one who gives rise to a mind of hate would not be carrying out my teaching. With that kind of instruction, there's just no scope left for righteous anger. Even when people are cutting me into pieces, I'm not allowed to get angry. I can't really think of anything where I could be allowed to get angry. So this is the attitude that is recommended for this horrible situation of being at the mercy of these bandits, staying stable in the mind, not getting angry, and even having compassion for them. I admit for me that seems a little bit stretching it, but at least not reacting with anger should be possible. So this kind of connects to the ethical dimension of the Brahmaviharas. And there's another passage I wanted us to look at. So this kind of confirms the potential of the Brahmaviharas and the reason why I have chosen them as a appropriate response to climate change and environmental destruction. They really are a gradual way of working our progress to the final type of liberation because they undermine unwholesome states of minds gradually, such that if someone had been practicing compassion or the other divine abodes from childhood onwards, they would no longer be able to do an unwholesome or bad deed. And in the discourse on the world ruler, it is precisely the decision not to kill, which in the early discourses is the standard expression of compassion. That is the turning point from the moral decline to the recovery. The actual meditation practice I will be presenting for this third lecture then naturally takes up compassion. The idea is that we continue with the earlier developed scan for the earth element with the monitoring dimension of mindfulness well established, the sense of gravity, the external earth, the breathing. And through mindfulness, we will notice the condition of the mind. And once we find that even for a little while the mind is free from distraction and defilements, we can touch in on that subtle, pleasant feeling of being in the present moment. That's a good starting point. And based on this established whole body and whole body awareness, the subtle pleasure of the present moment, the first step is to cultivate compassion, to arouse it. And there are different ways for that. Some prefer to use phrases or even just a word, just karuna, or may all beings be free from harm. It's good to have phrases that do not get too long, too complicated, too detailed, just something short and crisp. For others, it is easier to use some image, some picture, some kitten, puppy, little baby. In my own practice, I don't use any aids anymore, but for a long time I used a little animal that one time I saw. I was meditating outside, and this animal was being chased by a big snake, and it came just beside me to take like cover, and the snake went off. And I always think of this small little animal or something like a chameleon or so, and how he was just sitting beside me and shaking in fear, and that big snake coming in and moving away, and just my presence as I was meditating was giving that protection. That's an easy way for me to arouse that sense of compassion of may this little being not be harmed. And once we have found a way to arouse compassion, we shift from doing to being compassion. It means that rather than continuing to do something, we just rest in that condition of compassion and allow it to just spread and pervade our whole body and mind. That the whole body and mind is soaked and pervaded by compassion. And from there, then radiating it out is not something pushy or active even. It is more like the simile I like to use is like imagine a lamp that is surrounded by curtains, and we just softly, gently withdraw the curtains and let the light shine. Let it shine however long, however far it wants to shine. We don't have to push it out. All we need to do is to withdraw these curtains so that the radiation of compassion becomes truly boundless, immeasurable, appamana. And once we have opened up in all directions, for the continuity of the practice, it can be helpful to rely on the process of breathing. Natural breathing, but we are aware of inhalation and exhalation. And so with every inhalation, we can be more aware of the state of compassion within. And with every exhalation of that radiation, that spaciousness of the mind. It's just a little tool that helps us to remain dwelling with continuity in the Brahmavihara. I think that is about what I had on my mind for today. So just to sum it up briefly again, third noble truth, the vision of liberation, and as a path towards that, the temporary liberation of the Brahmaviharas as the key for harmonious living and improving ethics, in particular compassion in the form of wishing for the absence of harm, and as a foundation for the natural arising of compassion in our daily life, the meditative cultivation, similar to blowing the conch, that boundless radiation. Thank you for your attention.